cultural project is another question. But just in brackets, even if Europe were a cultural project, it still is the question what kind of cultural project, because culture is not an innocent child in itself, so it can go this or the other direction. But let's assume it's an important and enlightened cultural project. Then the next question is, why are so many people opposed to having a strong cultural component to the Union? You get a lot of acceptance for Europe and cultures and diversity, blah blah, but as soon as it comes to institutional issues, people are getting very nervous. And I think this is particularly cumbersome now in times when we can speak of a crisis of the Union. I'm convinced that we cannot stick with simple advocacy for culture. We have to almost develop a new Keynesianism for culture, kind of an anti-cyclic cultural campaign, which is not only based on money, but it's based on like more Europe and not less Europe. Well, first of all, everybody knows that the finance capitalism or the financial markets have kind of stripped off all the regulations and rules and have covered enormous ground and assumed that it could spread the risks evenly. The opposite was the case. Now the costs of this kind of ultra-liberal finance capitalism have to be borne by those who had never a chance to decide on the economic strategies. So actually we all have to pay the costs for this very risky space of surprise in which the finance managers have moved us. And so the amount of inequality and unevenness within the single countries, between social strata, but also between countries in Europe, has become enormous. And the we is melting, is getting smaller and smaller, and everybody is trying to defend his or her own small remit. And that affects also, of course, the non-market activities like health, education, and culture, and the arts. In many cities of Europe, in many regions of Europe, even in many countries, the art sector is heavily influenced by the lack of financial resources of the states, the cutting exercises of the states, which are a consequence of this capitalist crash. And what I find particularly relevant for culture is that societies have kind of responded to this huge crisis, not only at the extreme, let's say, fringes of society, those who have already lost a lot in what have kind of responded to this huge crisis, not only at the extreme, let's say, fringes of society, those who have already lost a lot in one type of societies into what we call the middle classes. And middle classes are becoming more and more, and their children are becoming more and more afraid of losing what they have got. And that leads to kind of what sociologists call the extremism of the middle classes. And what becomes more important for them, or for us if you want, is distinction. And then you use education, career paths through education, cultural distinctions as a last resort against the fear of losing. And thus, one of the kind of intermediary consequences of the financial crisis is that culture is more and more becoming a medium for distinction rather than for diversity, of segregation rather than unification or cooperation. Solidarity is vanishing, and what Bourdieu described is now at a peak, and that is really something dangerous, because we are observing now culturalization, meaning using culture as an instrument, both in our relations with other countries or with other people, citizens from other countries moving into Europe, but we experience it also in our internal segregation or stratification in society. So the cohesion within societies gets worse, and culture is used for that. That's something which leads to exclusion, and people have lost their trust that politicians can get it right, and there is little hope. There's a lot of skepticism, if not pessimism, and defensive attitudes, which are not very constructive for creating the future of the societies in Europe and in the world. Nobody knows that. I think what we can do is speculating whether or not and what could be helpful. Well, people would say the UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity was or still is a marker of progress in that field, and it is. But on the other hand, it empowers states and versus the markets, the free market, which is a good thing on the one hand. But on the other hand, if you look at the states in the world, then you have a vast majority of states whom you would not easily attest democratic behaviors or democratic structures. So you're empowering states. Some of them are in a very, very shabby state of art, and I'm not sure whether that really helps transnational cultural policies. Secondly, even within the European Union, it's difficult to develop transnational cultural policies. You know, as a cultural network, and many others know, how longish the process has been and will be, and how difficult it is to get the right chemistry of support at local level, national level, European level. So we are far from having a transnational cultural policy yet within Europe. So what does that mean on if we project that on a global level? I think thirdly, one mover which actually has developed or helped developing transnational policies, if you wish, is the market. And it's a very powerful instrument of crossing borders for cultural products, for cultural consumption, for cultural dissemination. And it's not automatically bad. I mean, there are many developments which we have to be very careful about, and we have to develop rules to limit it. But on the other hand, the markets have developed the ability of access, or have opened the gates for many people for access to cultural goods. Fourthly, I'm personally very much concerned about what the Union calls the neighborhood policy and the cultural component of neighborhood policy. When I was in Belarus, in Minsk, in spring 2010, cultural activists there, like well, I'm not quoting names because, yeah, you know, cultural activists and intellectuals blamed the Union's neighborhood policy and its civil society program or cultural program of actually supporting in a very crude or stupid way, unintendedly, what they call the bandit Lukashenko. And nobody listened to them. And they gave examples how impossible it was to benefit from European subsidies without getting an instrument for this regime. A couple of months later, We've seen what happened in December 2010 after the so-called elections. And the leaders of these artistic and civic movements are in jail and their families are oppressed. So transnational cultural policy in respect to the neighborhood is still has to be developed. And it needs a lot of investment also in thinking and in flexibility and speed. Take the Mediterranean. The EU responses to the Mediterranean civil societies have been rather bureaucratic and complicated, and now the civil societies there have taken the initiative in Egypt and Tunisia and in other countries. So will we now at least be in a position to speedily and flexibly respond and to provide facilities, contacts, resources to support the civic and cultural movements on the ground? I have doubts. And the last point on that question is the development of European external cultural relations. I think that is a very important topic for the future. But again, it's not high on the list, on the agenda of the foreign policy experts. It's the member states' contribution to that development of policy are slow and in a way reflecting the difficulties of the Union being very, very, very heterogeneous in their approaches, in their takes. And so there is not much to be seen by now, and I think civil society, cultural networks, foundations have a big role to play to go to the public and to demonstrate what the soft power and the dialogue-based external cultural policy can achieve for Europe, and what it needs to be developed. So if we wait for the institutions, be it the member states' institutions or the union's institutions, we will probably wait for too long. So that's really a field where I think that civil society has a responsibility to go one step further. I think one possible answer could be win back the trust of the citizens and the cultural operators, which you may have lost. So build relations with the sector. That's number one. The second is you can only do that if you are open. So the representatives of the institutions risk openness and risk frankness, clarity, even if it is controversial and conflictuous. Third, don't reduce culture to the creative industries. I mean, many good arguments have been made for showing and demonstrating the cultural power of the economic power of culture, but what is really important in the end is that we create the legacy of the future. That means investing in arts as well. And I think then, as a side effect, you may have a lot of benefits for tourism and for economic developments. But at the beginning, I think there should be a clear and non-disputable plaidoyer for the freedom of the arts in Europe and support for the arts in Europe. And the last point maybe to this question, be open for the unexpected. Leave the paths of your institutional thinking and try to be open for good opportunities. One example which I'm concerned with is Sarajevo 2014, because then we have 100 years of the beginning of the First World War, and the European Parliament has made a proposal to declare Sarajevo a cultural capital in 2014, so to kind of invest a lot of thought and empowerment and cooperation in a very visible activity which has to do with the wars in Yugoslavia, coming to a final end, preparing a transition of the Balkans into the European Union, blah, 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 the transition of the Dayton Agreement. So there are many things which are still on the agenda, and Sarajevo 2014 could be a fantastic opportunity. But of course, it's not in the papers. There is no legal ground for such a special action. The Parliament as a whole has warmly recommended that, but the Commission says we don't have legal basis for that, and with that they go to the member states, to the Council. But I think inventing such a brilliant idea and then stopping it and say it's not possible is just too short-sighted. We need the possibility to be flexible, and if that is very, very painful within the institutions, then again, partnerships with private actors, civil society actors, could help. I think it would be a perfect opportunity. But it's just one example. There would probably be many more. Very simply put, support young people, because they have many are really interested in cosmopolitan life. Support artists, and move from the old discussion, which many of us cannot hear anymore, of protecting cultural diversity. And yes, of course, but move from that taboo, from this kind of fetish, to the new diversities, which is a field of action which is absolutely urgent in many of our societies. So the new citizens, the new communities, many of them are not really new, but they're still not integrated. And I think cultural institutions have a lot to do in this respect. We are still white. We are still making a program which is close to the old canons. We have not integrated migrant experts, artists, into the boards of cultural institutions, into the decision-making structures. I mean, there are countries like the UK who are much more advanced in that respect, but in other countries, a lot is to do, and a shame on us, non-governmental sector organizations. The market is much further in that respect. So invest in those who bear the hope for the future and change the cultural institutions' habits, and do it seriously. But I know that has been said since many years. It seems to be an endless story. But I'm optimistic in the long run on that. 3 points. First, it can go wrong, and it's not really to be totally excluded that culture is used, phrased, interpreted, instrumentalized in a totally wrong way. Segregation, distinction instead of diversity, replacing negative items like class or religious groups by culture, using culture as an instrument of creating new segregation lines within societies, and split the world again in the haves and the have-nots. How do you say that? Have-nots. Yeah. So I'm concerned with the power of the extremist groups in our societies. They start with closing the borders again. The policy versus asylum seekers and migrants is getting worse and worse and worse, even in most Latin countries. But we know that what is relatively new is that it has really crept into the heart of societies, the so-called middle classes. And there we have an enormous responsibility. That leads me to my next point. I think it's not right to wait for politicians. It's not right to blame others. It's really now the point to say, what is our responsibility in that societal battle, if you want. And that means that campaigns like the We Are More campaign would probably benefit from a rethinking, moving it away from the at least perceived focus on money. I mean, yes, money is a very important thing, and transnational projects suffer from lacking resources on local level and national level. If the EU money also would disappear or get smaller, that would be a problem. But it's not really about money at this moment. At this moment, we are experiencing a deep crisis of our of our society, and We Are More should develop into we need more of the we, more of Europe, and this is our contribution. So to turn it around and not to ask for something, but to do something and to launch a fervent and powerful campaign which mobilizes people wherever they stand for a new political culture.